We're going to compare some different receptors here. Just look back a little bit. The olfactory receptors were specialized sensory neurons. The gustatory receptors communicated with sensory neurons. Photoreceptors responded to light. And, they routed the information directly to the central nervous system. And all were located in epithelia that were exposed to the external environment. It's a little different with equilibrium and hearing because these are separate or isolated from the external environment. And the organs for equilibrium and hearing are in the inner ear. The information is organized right there in the inner ear, and then that information is forwarded to the central nervous system. So we have hair cells in this for hearing and equilibrium. And hair cells are sensory receptors in the internal ear. And here's our hair cell, and it is covered with stereocilia and one single kinocilium. And these will be stimulated and move in different directions. So hair cells are mechanoreceptors, and they're sensitive to contact or movement. The hair cells will be pushed upon. Those the kinocilium, stereocilia will move, and it's going to distort the plasma membrane, altering the neurotransmitter release, and send information about the strength of the stimulus. It is a complex three-dimensional structure in the internal ear, and we'll look at that structure in a second. And we have two different types of hair cells, or at least they respond to two different stimuli. Hair cells in one area of the inner ear respond to gravity or linear acceleration. Hair cells in the other area of the inner ear respond to rotation or sound. So we'll look at the anatomy of the ear. The ear, look at this darker blue bar up on top. The ear is divided into the external ear, the middle ear, and the internal ear. And the external ear is composed of the auricle, made of elastic cartilage, and this opening through the temporal bone called the external acoustic meatus. Remember, a meatus is a canal through bone. Inside here we'll find glands called ceruminous glands, and they secrete earwax or cerumen, and this earwax keeps foreign particles out of the ear and slows growth of bacteria. And hairs are also present here. In the external acoustic meatus, the hairs will trap any debris getting in. And so you can see that external acoustic meatus will go to this blue object here, the tympanic membrane. So the middle ear is called the tympanic cavity, and it's air-filled, and it goes from the tympanic membrane to the auditory ossicles, and it also connects the back of the throat to the middle ear, and this is the auditory tube. The tympanic membrane is a thin sheet, and it responds to sound waves by vibrating. And the auditory ossicles are three tiny bones, the tiniest bones in the body, that connect this tympanic membrane to the inner ear. And here are these tiny auditory ossicles called the malleus, incus, and stapes. You used to know them as the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. We don't use those terms. We use malleus, incus, and stapes. So the internal ear is more complex, and it contains sensory organs for hearing and equilibrium. Sound waves will come in. They'll be funneled in by the auricle and go through the external acoustic meatus And these sound waves are going to then become amplified as they travel. They're going to stimulate the eardrum to vibrate, stimulate the bones to move, and then the final bone, the stapes, will stimulate the inner ear. In this inner ear, you can see this snail-like object that's called the cochlea. And then there are 3 rings attached to the cochlea. These 3 rings are called semicircular canals. And there is a region connecting the semicircular canals with the cochlea called the vestibule. And this whole bony thing, this whole bony shape here is called the bony labyrinth. So the middle ear has a connecting canal to the pharynx. It is called the auditory tube. It used to be called the eustachian tube. And this allows equalization of pressure on both sides of the tympanic membrane. If there's too much pressure on one side or the other, it will cause the eardrum to vibrate less easily, and sound will be diminished. The problem with this auditory tube is children often are laying on their back. They have a smaller auditory tube. It's more of a slant, and microorganisms can travel into the middle ear, causing otitis media or ear infection. The auditory ossicles are the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, and they are going to attach. They're going to connect the eardrum with a region on the inner ear called the oval window. So the eardrum attaches to the malleus articulates with the incus articulates with the stapes, and the stapes is attached to the oval window, which is a membrane. In the middle ear, remember this is called the tympanic cavity, it's air-filled. Well, there are 2 structures that will prevent the eardrum from vibrating too vigorously when loud sounds are heard. This first muscle here is the tensor tympani, and that connects the malleus to the temporal bone, and that will stiffen when there is a loud contraction or a loud noise. It will stiffen to prevent too much movement of the tympanic membrane. And then the stapedius muscle is going to attach the stapes. See that little tiny little stapedius muscle here attaching the stapes to the posterior wall of the tympanic cavity. And that will also reduce movement, but it will reduce the movement of the stapes at the oval window. And then you're going to see all these little tiny stabilizing ligaments in here as well. Sound waves will enter the external acoustic meatus, vibrate the tympanic membrane, just like if you hit a drum, the drum head will vibrate, and this is converting the sound waves to mechanical movement. And then the movement of the membrane will move the auditory ossicles. So the auditory ossicles are going to take or conduct those vibrations to the internal ear. It focuses the sound on the oval window and it amplifies the sound. In the internal ear, we are going to look at the details of the bony labyrinth. And here you can see the bony labyrinth, which is tan. And inside the bony labyrinth is the membranous labyrinth. This snail-shaped area is the cochlea. This region here, this hallway between the 2 of them, is the vestibule, and these rings are called the semicircular canals. There is fluid inside the membrane, and that's called endolymph. So here if you look at this round structure here, it's a slice through a semicircular canal. And you can see the bony labyrinth on the outside, the membranous labyrinth, but there's fluid inside the membranous labyrinth called endolymph, and there's fluid between the membranous labyrinth and the bony labyrinth, and that's called perilymph. So those fluids are separated from each other by the membrane. The membranous labyrinth is a collection of fluid-filled tubes and chambers. It houses receptors for hearing and equilibrium. And the endolymph is within the membranous labyrinth. Three parts, the semicircular canals, the utricle, and the saccule are part of the vestibular complex, which maintains equilibrium. So let's go back to that previous slide, and here are the semicircular canals. And think of them as a three-dimensional on an XY axis. You can have X and Y, but you can also have Z, a Z-axis, all three dimensions. So they're three-dimensional. And then here in the vestibule, you're going to find the utricle and the saccule. And so here in the vestibule, the utricle and saccule and the membranous, the semicircular canals are for equilibrium. So the semicircular ducts, which is the membrane within the semicircular canals, have receptors that are stimulated by rotation of the head. And in the vestibule, the utricle and saccule, that is where gravity and linear acceleration are sensed. In the cochlea, the membrane in there is the cochlear duct, and that is has the receptors for sound. So while we talk about the inner ear as being important for equilibrium and for hearing, there's two types of equilibrium: rotational equilibrium and gravity and linear acceleration. Here's our membranous labyrinth, the semicircular ducts, the saccule and utricle and saccule here, and then the cochlear duct is for hearing. The semicircular ducts, you don't need to know the names of them, but at the base of each semicircular duct is a little tiny object called an ampulla, and inside that ampulla you will find receptors. So here's the ampulla enlarged, and you can see the hair cells, and the ampullary cupula is kind of filled with gelatin, and it has the kinocilia and stereocilia of the hair cells in that gelatin. When our head rotates in a plane of a duct, it's going to move the endolymph. So if you move your head in different directions, it's going to cause stimulation of the hair cells in one direction or the other. So shaking your head no, nodding your head yes, tilting your head to the side is going to stimulate one or the other of those three semicircular ducts. Now the utricle and the saccule are different. Let's see, a little too much detail here. But the utricle and the saccule are inside are This is more gel, but there are what are called ear stones, otoliths, and they respond to